We're okay. We're on Vav Gimel Amud Aleph, and about the middle of the page. We started last week going into detail into the discussion. We said that the machlokas between Rava and Rava was also machlokas of Tanoim between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and we got into that a little bit from our Mishnah. As to whether or not something that has a shinui, something that has a sort of a siman, if you will, an identifying mark, has to be returned or not. So the Tanakama of Meir is more lenient, somewhat like Rabbah, and Rabbi Yehuda is more machmer, more similar to Rabbah. And so the Gemara, as we started last week, was telling us more detail about the machlokas Tanoim, in order for us to understand that that machlokas was slightly different than the machlokas of the Amoraim, because otherwise the question arose: why did the Amoraim have a discussion on the machlokas that was identical to something that was done, let's say, 100, 200 years earlier? Because the Mishnah preceded the Gemara by several, over several centuries. I mean, this is an ongoing thing. But if the Tanoim already had a dispute, then the Amoraim can come along and say, "Oh, we have a dispute," because it's really totally on the machlekes of the Tanoim. So the Gemara started into that. Now, just for a little background, again, there are three variables that the Gemara talks about. Three different variables that are important in this discussion. One variable is the question of siman haba me'elav hava siman. What does a siman ba me'elav means? That if there is a siman, something unusual, which wasn't man-made. In other words, a person didn't make the siman in order to say, this is mine because look, I did something. And the example that the Mishnah gave is what happens if a small sliver of glass falls into a pot where figs are being pressed and you have a shard of glass inside. So that could be man-made, or it could be accidental. So if it's accidental, then the question is that a machlokes of the Tanoim? And the answer is yes, that there's a machlokes Tanoim whether siman haba me'elav have a siman or not. That's one case of machlokes. The second machlokes is mavirin al ha'ochlin. Do people walk by a piece of food on the ground and not pick it up? So we had said a couple of weeks ago that, among, in the Jewish custom, that's something that we don't do. In other words, we pick up food, we don't allow it there. But apparently in those times, there were places where people didn't pick up. If the food was trampled on and it was not pleasant, then they left it for the collectors, the garbage collectors, so to speak, to pick it up. So people didn't walk around picking up food, and we'll see in a minute why that's material. And the third machlokes is whether siman ha'asher lidrus is a siman or not. In other words, if it's a siman that more likely than not will be trampled on and disfigured, is it still a siman? So those are three variables. The Gemara mixes and matches to see how we come out. Okay, so that's how we started the Gemara last week. And just to recite the most recent discussion, we're going to start from the Rabba Omalach. That's about maybe 6 or so lines from the wide lines, before the wide lines, the last words, the Rabba Omalach. Now, Rabba, remember, is Mekel. So he takes the position, the Kula Alma, Simon also Lidris Loy have a Simon. Remember, he takes the position that siman that can be trampled is not a siman. Why is it not a siman? Because if everybody's going to trample on it, there's no way of knowing whose it is. Therefore, if a person loses property, and let's say he does it in a public place, he'll clearly be miyayish because he knows that that siman that he had on that particular item will be trampled on and will no longer be recognized. So Rabbah says, siman also lidus lo have a siman, the ein maviran ana oflin, and people do not walk by food, which means that there is a possibility that it will not be trampled on, because if someone sees food on the ground, he's going to pick it up. So what do we have? We have simin that, in other words, if you trample on the simin, it's not considered a simin. But wait a minute, there's a likelihood that it won't be trampled on because people will pick it up. So what's the answer? And the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, according to this view, is v'hacha b'simin habome elav kamifaga. Remember the third variable, whether or not a simin that comes from itself, meaning that you didn't place it there, whether or not that's a valid simin. Tanakama lo have a simin, Rabbi Yehuda Omar have a simin. Tanakama, who's lenient, says, how can a simin habome elav be a simin? In other words, a person is never mechaben. He never really has his kavana, his intent on making that a siman, because he doesn't know. In other words, we're talking about something that one can't know. So if one can't know it, then you really can't rely on it. Rabbi Yehuda, who's machmir, says, nevertheless, the person who finds it needs to call it out on the off chance that a person might say, you know something, that really could be mine because I was working. You know, he doesn't know it's a siman. It's a siman habome elov, but because he will extrapolate, you know, I was working around these shards of glass. I know that, and therefore it's possible, even though I didn't know it, that is mine because it fell in. So Rabbi Yehuda goes so far as to be machmir and say siman habome elov have a siman, and therefore you have to announce it. So according to this version, and we're going back and forth, by the way, according to Rabbah, the machlokes, why he this wasn't the machlokes of Meroyim. This is not what Rabbah and Rabbah are arguing about. We're trying to understand the machlokes of Tanoim as to why their machlokes is different, and therefore Rabbah and Rabbah can announce their machlokes. So in this version of the machlokes, it all falls on the question of whether siman habome elov have a siman. According to Rabbi Meir, it's not a siman, and therefore you don't have to announce it. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, it is a siman, and you have to announce it. So that's where we left off last week in that variable.
Hey, Rabbi,
Yes.
that reason to say it could be mine because I work near the glass, I mean,
Yes.
that's a far-fetched probability from the way we would think today.
Correct. So this shows you the chumrah of Rabbi Yehuda. You're absolutely right. Why Rabbi Yehuda says that if there is even the slightest possibility of someone awakening and saying, because you made this announcement, in other words, if you hadn't made the announcement, no one would ever know. But because you said, I found a piece of glass in a cake of figs, and a person says to himself, I didn't put that there, but I was working around shards of glass. So in other words, Rabbi Yehuda goes the extra mile and says, in order to, remember, we're dealing with a mitzvah in the Torah, right? Hoshev Teshev, Hashavas Aveda. So the question is, how easily do we obviate the mitzvah? No one wants to obviate a mitzvah in the Torah and say you shouldn't return it. The question is, how far-fetched is it that you should?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
What's the downside?
okay.
What's the downside of making an announcement? I mean, it's not a big deal to go make an announcement and just wait to see if somebody responds. The way you can assure that the mitzvah, if necessary, would actually happen. It just seems to me that what's the big deal? You make an announcement. It doesn't cost anything, and it's a tremendous insurance policy. It's an insurance policy.
It's an insurance policy, right? So the Flim B'Shur said then one should actually make it. I think what the Gemara is trying to show us here is not the outcome of the halacha that you should or shouldn't. It's using the seichel of when a person is miyayish. In other words, you could always say be machmir. You can always say let's take the more stringent view and do something even though you don't have to do it. What the Gemara is trying to make us understand, or to give us to understand, is if you can always do it, then do it. But what is the minimum standard? The minimum standard is, do you have to do it? Okay, it's always better to say, if I can do a mitzvah that's a little bit more mahudar, I should do that mitzvah. But not everybody can do that mitzvah. So we're
Rabbi?
yeah, go ahead.
Go to, so then and you may have covered this last week, I apologize, but then the concept of miyayish, it seems to be applied differently here than in other cases. In other words, somebody loses an item and there's no identifying mark to it. There's no siman to it. So when they finally realize that it fell out of their pocket, they say it's gone. And then when somebody else picks it up, they say, you know what, I'm sure they're miyayish and therefore I can keep it. If this siman here is a siman that the person who made the food was not aware of, when he loses this piece of food and he realizes it fell off his cart or he lost a piece of food, not knowing that there is a siman, he's miyayish, he gives up hope. So when somebody finds it, why can't they simply say, there's no apparent siman, this person would not know that something was baked into his bread, and therefore he was miyayish, let him keep it. Just like if somebody, I don't know, he loses his wallet, he's on a cruise and he loses his wallet, it falls over the side. Even if somebody finds the wallet, it's got all the identifying marks in it, the assumption is, I think, the person who lost the wallet says, I lost it in the water, or the fact that it drifted somewhere and somebody picked it up, they can assume that he gave up hope. Why? It seems like miyayish is treated differently here.
Well, again, what you said is absolutely correct. In other words, the whole idea of yish is the normal person in a normal in a normal circumstance, would he be miyayish or not? So if someone loses a wallet on a boat, yes, even with all the simonim in the world, Rabbi Yehuda would admit and say, there's clearly yish here because he's not getting that wallet back. And the fact that some native off the coast is going to see his name and picture will mean nothing. And therefore, he has to be miyayish. The question that Rabbi Yehuda is raising here is, and it's an interesting question, and that is, when a person doesn't know something, and there is a chance that, remember, the factors that this Gemara is quoting is people will step on items, which of course can cause disfiguration, but people pick things up. So the likelihood of that stepping disfiguration won't happen because people are mavirin ala othel. They don't pass by. So now we have one up and one down. We know that people will give up if it's stepped on, but you're living in a community where it won't get stepped on. Fine. That's so we're now what's the third variable? The third variable is whether or not someone who doesn't know there is a siman there, but hears there's a siman and extrapolates in his circumstance that could be mine. In other words, you're right. We're now stepping into a different realm of what you and I were talking about the normal cases of simanim, where there is or isn't a siman and you lose it. Here, we have a case where there is a siman, but the person he didn't put it there. But since he had a cake of figs, and because he was working in an area where there was a lot of glass and broken glass, he can sort of extrapolate and put two and two together. It's probably mine. The question then is there a need to announce it so that such a person would he be miyayish? And so Rav Meir says, of course he'd be miyayish. He doesn't know there's a sin in there, right? So once he loses it, he loses it. Rabbi Yehuda says, wait a minute, it's not so fast. We're living in a place where people will pick up items. So if there was a siman, it may not be trampled on, and there may be some nuance of that item that will register with this guy, and he'll say, you know what, that really is mine because I was the one, I was working around glass and it fell. So you're right, it is different than the regular. And Rabbi Yehuda, who's more machmir, says that I would hold in that case, even though the likelihoods aren't great, the very fact that, and what's key here is that ein mavirin ala ochlin, because everybody says once it gets trampled on, it's gone. But since you don't pass by the food in this particular example, there is the outside possibility, and he takes the position that Hashavas Haveda it's important enough that you should announce it. Notwithstanding, Jay, what you just said, why not always announce it? Because after all, it's a mitzvah, and worst comes to worst, nothing happens. again, you can take that position, but in the discussion here in the Gemara, we're eschewing that position. We're saying that's not the position we want to say, the fallback position. Always say Hashavas Aveda. Let's get to the bottom of whether or not something in its infancy needs Hashavas Aveda. Is there even the Metzias of Hashavas Aveda? And in this particular case, the machlokes between Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Meir is lenient, and he says you can always announce, but you don't have to announce. And Rabbi Yehuda says you have to announce, because this really is a case where there is more than a reasonable possibility that someone will react to the announcement. So I think maybe that's the way to look at it, is you can always say announce, but do you minimally have to announce? So to your point, Jay, why don't we always announce? Yeah, sure. We can always clap on the table and say that anybody lose and no one will come up because no one even has a havamina that it was his. But
Rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda is coming up with a scenario where a person seemingly would be miyayish, but then can basically reverse it. In other words, even though he presumably has given up hope because he does not know about this hidden simon, when it's announced and he realizes that he was working near shards of glass, hey, yeah, that's mine. He can reverse his being miyayish and still claim the item.
Well, not exactly, because he wasn't miyayish because ein mavirin al ha'oflin. In other words, that little circumstance where people will not pass by the food makes it less likely that it will be trampled on and disfigured before someone picks it up. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the person who lost the item will say, you know what? I lost an item, but people are nice here. They don't walk by items. So you know what? Maybe there is the possibility. Remember, he always wants to find a way to recover. Rabbi Yehuda does. Therefore, he says, since there is the possibility that my food might not be trampled on, someone may find it and make some kind of announcement. Now, he doesn't know there's a siman. He doesn't know there's a siman because that siman was me'elov. But nevertheless, because people don't leave food lying around, he says, you know what? This is a nice community. Someone might say, did anybody lose this particular item, whatever the food item was? And of course, there isn't a siman, but nevertheless.
Rabbi, I don't want to belabor the point, and we'll let the shiur continue. But the way you're describing it, he believes that people will be careful with their food. They won't trample on the food. If anything, they'll pick it up and look around to see if there's an owner. But if there's no apparent siman, and that's I guess that's the piece that I'm troubled with. If there's no apparent siman, his challah looks exactly like the next person's challah, the next person's challah. So even if food's not going to be trampled, why would he believe that even if somebody picks up and announces it, if there's no siman, how does he claim it, not knowing that there's something hidden inside? Or does this go back to where we talked about, well, I found an item of food at the corner of Fulham and Lamberton. Did anybody lose an item of food? Can you tell me what food you lost? I mean, maybe it's the location piece that he uses to identify.
We're gonna come to location in a minute, right? We're gonna come to location in a minute. But,
okay, all right.
Yeah.
Let's go back. Can I ask the fundamental? If somebody finds something in the street, he has an obligation to announce it, or he has permission to take it with no obvious simanim. Why wouldn't he be required to announce it and take it unless somebody claims, well, it could be mine, whatever? Because somebody lost something. It wasn't the same thing lost by 2 people or 3 people. The likelihood is if somebody lost something, it's a unique event in that whole city at that time, and it should be announced because there's obviously somebody who lost it. Why do you have to have a siman before you then say you must announce, if I have it correct?
Right. So the fundamental question is, why not announce everything regardless? And the answer is that we're not going to be matriach people whenever they find something on the ground that looks like nothing unusual, and it looks totally ordinary, that they have to go out of their way to return it, make an announcement. In other words, there's a standard. You're right. You could always say, announce everything and let's make it, forget about it. Why is there even a machlekes? The teretz is because we want to balance the merits here of someone who has something and lost it and someone who found it. If he has to go through the tircha, and it is a tircha, of announcing it, going and doing and whatever, he'll say, you know what, I don't need it. I'm going to leave it on the ground. I'm just going to walk away. So we're trying to find a balancing here between people who have lost something and whether or not they are miyayish. And remember, that's really the key. The key is understanding what in the mind of the person who lost it, what's his mindset? Is he going to give up and say, I'm never finding this again? In which case it's hefker. Someone, again, you're walking on the street anywhere and you find something on the street. Is your first inclination, I've got to announce this? I mean, again, something that
nowadays we have.
Jen, we're talking about something that isn't unusual. In other words, something that everybody could possess.
You find a quarter on the ground.
Nowadays,
You say,
Yeah.
hey, did you lose a quarter? He says,
Yeah.
yeah, I do. Does it have George Washington on it?
Yeah, exactly.
no, but if somebody loses something that's not money, because money could be anybody's, but you find a yarmulke on the street and it's a child-sized yarmulke.
Right.
Nowadays, we have all the tools to announce with no tircha. You put it on a list server that somebody
Right.
lose.
Okay. But in the time of the Gemara, again, in the time of the Gemara, you're talking about, I mean, without all of the advancements that we have here, Hashavas Haveda may have been a much more difficult thing to do because of just the logistics of it. Just the logistics of it. If someone finds something in a village and he has to go to the city and announce it because in the village there's no way of doing it. I mean, you're really putting upon people. So this is a balancing test. And remember, in some way, it's more sort of a theoretical than an actual. But in a theoretical sense, what's the underlying human condition when a person loses something? Because that's where it all starts. It all starts in the mind of the person who lost it. Do we say more likely than not that he will be miyayish because he has no hope of returning it? I mean, again, the wallet falling off the ship or any such thing. I mean, how would he possibly understand it? So again, we can go around and around, and these are all very probing and good questions. So we're saying it's always good to be mekayem mitzvah Shabbos Aveda, no question about it. So if you could do it, you do it. Now let's go and understand when is a Shabbos Aveda an absolute and when is it not an absolute. So let's just assume that it's not an absolute. And there are times when a person says, you know what, I'm just walking away. I don't want to bother with it. So the Gemara is giving us sort of a balancing test and telling us there are times when you have to be go extra mile and times when you don't. Now, basically, Rav Meir is makel. He's saying that there are less times when you have to be machmir on it. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, no, I don't. All right, so let's go a little bit further because a lot of this will unfold even more. So now we're up to Ikeda Amri. So we just gave an explanation in Rabbah. Now, there are those who are going to turn this around, these variables that we talk about, and talk about them in a different fashion. Ikeda Amri, Savua de Kula Almin, Siman Abba Me'elav, Hava Siman. Okay, now we're turning it on its ear and we're saying no. Both Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda agree that a siman habo me'elav have a siman, that a siman that a person didn't put in it, but all of a sudden there's this shard of glass found, that is a siman. That can be counted as a siman. The siman also lidros loy have a siman, but a siman that is stepped on and kicked around is not a siman. So what's the machlokes? My lab, mavir lana okol kamiflige. Now the machlokes, according to this Iked Amre between Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, is whether or not people will allow food to lie on the ground. The Marsava Mavirin, the Tanakhama says people leave it and therefore it gets kicked around and therefore there's no longer a simin because it's trampled. Marsava ain't Mavirin. And Rabbi Yehuda says people don't leave things just lying around. Therefore, if a person has a potential simin, or there's a potential simin that could come out of it, he's not going to be miyayish because we're talking in a pristine society where people don't let food lie around. And if people don't let food lie around, then a person who loses something in his mind, again, Jay, in his mind will say that someone might announce it because it'll be an intact piece of food. And he'll say, yes, did anybody lose this loaf of bread or this piece of meat or whatever it happens to be? In other words, so in his mind, he will not be miyayish because there's an outside possibility that something will come out. Now, what's the likelihood? We're not going to play odds here, but all we're going to say is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is that likelihood, and therefore someone will do it. Now, it might be 99 times no, 1 yes. And again, so according to Rabbi Meir, there's clearly not any reason to announce, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, who's machmir, he takes the position that where there is even the slightest possibility of there being recovery, you have to announce it, even if it will never happen. Again, so he takes a much more stringent position. But again, what we're trying to understand is that what is that machlokes of Tanoim that is different than Rabba and Rava. So we're trying to find between these three variables a circumstance where Rabbi Meir will say one thing and Rabbi Yehuda will say another thing. So now, if you say that that's the case, Amar Rav Zvid Mishmei de Rava. Rav Zvid says in the name of Rava. Remember, Rava is now the more machmir. Isol kedat of Savatana Siman also libis lo have a siman. If you say in the Tanakama that a siman it can be trampled is not a siman. Umavirin ala oklin, and people walk by food. Kikro shel balabayas b'shusarabim mamay makriz. Remember, we distinguished between general baked goods and baked goods that in your own home. So in other words, general baked goods, they stamp them out. Every loaf of bread looks the same. But when you bake in your own home, your bread is different. In other words, it's unique, and therefore that's the siman. The siman is the bread itself because it's different. So why do we say that if a person dropped a loaf of bread from his own private stock in the Rishus Harabim, why does the Mishnah say machriz that he has to call it out? If you take the position that a siman also lidrus lo have a siman that will be stepped on, meaning that it'll be disfigured, is not a siman, and mavir and ala ochlin, people don't pick up food, then you'll never have a case where a private loaf of bread will ever be recognizable, because forget about the fact that it's your personal bread as opposed to the baker's bread. If people step all over it, all it is a splashed piece of flour, right? Flour and water just sits there, and people will let it sit there. How will you know? How will anybody know that it is your unique bread and not the bread of a baker? So why does in other words, he's asking Akasha, according to this view, why do we even, in a case where there is something unusual, if people will step on it, it'll no longer be recognizable. So why will that be a siman? If you take the position that you want to be more lenient, then even in a case where there is a reason not to be lenient because it's private bread, it's your own private stock, it's not going to look like anything different than the public bread at the end of the day. People aren't going to pick it up. People will trample on it. Horses will ride over it. And before you know it, you're going to have nothing that can be recognized as your own bread. So now, again, it's a little circular, this Gemara, but so Rav Zvid says in the name of Rava, Kula alma savar siman also lidrus haver siman. So now we got to step back and we have to say that siman also lidrus haver siman, meaning that a siman that can be trampled on is still considered a siman. So a person will not be miyayish. Umavirin al ha'ochlet. And we're talking about where people will not pick up food. So now we're back to the first view that we saw before, which was in Rabbah. Now it's in Rabbah. That siman habo me'elav kom miflegi. The Tanakh sava siman habo me'elav lo have a siman. Rabbi Yehuda sava have a siman. So in other words, again, all these questions are valid because the question is just do it. The teretz is we're trying to understand just do it is always an answer. But when don't you have to do it? It's like Rav Moshe, as Gonzalez Rafa always used to say, the Rebbeinu Shalom will have kindness on him, not why he was machmer, not why he was makel, but why he was machmer. In other words, to say machmer, to say no is an easy thing to say, and therefore you cover all bases. But to say yes in the face of something that may be no, that's where the skill of a paisik comes in. So we're kind of saying the same thing, Jay. It's always right to say, I'm going to go to the bima and hit clap the bima, that anybody lose. Okay, you know what? Tava Allah bracha. If you do it all the time, you do it all the time. But as a practical matter, it's not always the thing to do. The Gemara is trying to give us an understanding. Remember, this is before the halacha, before Shulchan Aruch. So the Gemara was the halacha. So the Gemara at that point in time, when there's a consensus, that's the halacha. So we're trying to be practical and tell people who come up to the Rav and say, Rav, what should I do? Should I return it? Should I not return it? So the Gemara here, the halacha is telling you, you know what? Go home. Don't worry about it. Don't make yourself meshuga. Don't run to the main shul 3 kilometers away and clap and tish. In other words, you don't have to go around from shul to shul and make an announcement. So in that particular place, yes, there is a greater likelihood that the person who lost the item will be miyayish because of these circumstances. So that's why the way we have to look at it really is what's practical and what's not practical.
I think we should take note, and if it was next week after we had read Kiseitse, we'd see this in the Torah, that the procedure the Torah really lays out is for something that if you don't know who lost it,
Right.
You don't recognize your neighbor's item, you take it to your house and you wait until somebody comes looking for it. Obviously, if a person comes looking for it, they were never miyayesh. They had hopes, and then they're going around looking for it. But that the Torah lays that out specifically, in the parsha. So the idea then is, if you know it, who it was, return it. If you don't know it, it's important enough, take it to your house. But obviously, as you said, you're not going to pick up a crushed a mass of dough, bring it to your house, because that would be, utterly, useless.
Right.
But the idea would be that but their basic idea is return it if you know it. Otherwise, take it to your house and wait a period of time. I think we'll come to that later. What's the period of time? But you take it to your house and you wait for somebody who hasn't given up on it to come and look for it.
Right. But I think also the Gemara, and we'll see this just in a minute when we wrap it up, is that the Gemara is what is human nature? Is human nature such that the person is so stubborn that he loses something and he'll never give up? So if it's something near and dear to him that has some identity, a person might hold on longer and say, I'm not miyayish, because this is something that I know there's a possibility someone will find it. I know there is. And look, how many times, and again, the more identity, the better, there are good Samaritans who all of a sudden you'll get a call and say, are you Joe Smith? Yes. I have a wallet here and I found it on aisle 32, section 41 in Yankee Stadium when there was 47,000 people there. But is this you? And he says, oh my gosh, I long since gave up on that wallet that I lost it. So what is human nature that a person will say, you know what, Fallen, as we say. It's over. Okay. So we're not talking about that kind of situation. So we're talking about a situation where the word didn't travel quickly, and there had to be all kinds of people had to go out of their way and do this and do that. You know what the expression agapara. Let that be a kapara, and I move on.
Yeah, Rabbi.
It's human nature that we're talking about. Yeah, Jay.
Yeah, this whole Gemara is talking about the found side of the story. What about the lost side of the story? Does somebody have to get involved with the making announcements that I lost something?
So give me a couple of minutes and we're going to answer that question, right? The lost side of the story. That's the one ingredient which the Gemara is going to touch on in just a minute. A good question.
Look ahead.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So now, Varava Amalach, okay, that was in Rava, and now the first wide line, Varava Amalach, the Kula Alma Simon Osalidus Loy have a Simon. Remember, Rava says it is a Simon because he's Machmir. Rava says Kula Alma Loy have a Simon. The Ein Mavir and Allah Ochlin, and people don't, people do pick up food. So in other words, there is a possibility that it won't be trampled. The Simon Abom Elav come if we get Tanakam the Sava, Simon Abom Elav law of the Simon. Rabbi Yehuda Sava have a Simon. All right. So again, we're going around and we're trying to take all these variables, put them into a pot, figure out which variable is the sort of the legislative simon here that we're talking about, and the Gemara comes out with all kinds of different permutations, and that's really, I think, more than anything else for us to understand is that there is no one clear picture of what's coming out of here. So. And I think that's the purpose of this, is that the Gemara is trying to tell us that the machlokes. Remember, what was the key question? The question was, why are Rabbah and Rava arguing about something that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir argued centuries before? The answer is because Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir were arguing over things that had so many different variables that there was no one particular answer as to what was the key to making it understand. Therefore, Rabbah and Rava came along. Whatever it was, 100 years later, 200 years later, I mean, within the Amoraic period, and they said, this is the machlokes. Yes, Meir and Yehuda had these machlokes, but they were in all these different areas. So that's essentially the exercise the Gemara is teaching us here, without necessarily coming to a specific conclusion. So now, the question that Jay asked is material. So we're talking about the finder and what he's all about. What about the guy who lost it? We totally forgot about the victim. What about him? Amar Rav Zvid Mishmei de Rava, 4 lines from the bottom. Rav Zvid says in the name of Rava, Klolo da Avidita. This is the general rule of lost objects. Kiven the Amar Vailo Lishisorin Kis Miyayish Lo Minei. You don't have to announce. In other words, it's not something that the person has to clap and tish and say, you know what, I lost this item, I give up, and therefore whoever finds it it's found. No. In other words, what we're saying is, and again, you have to understand how one would know this, but he's saying that if a person says to himself, or he turns to his wife, or he turns to his children in the house and says, Vailo l'chasarn kish. Oh, woe is to me that I lost this item. He's already miyayish. Without making a public announcement, you can have yish. That's what the Gemara is telling us, that yish does not require someone saying to the public, I lost an item, I'm being miyayish. Anybody finds it, don't bother coming to me. It's lost. You don't have to do that. We again, this is extrapolating sometimes maybe from the obvious or not so obvious, is that if it's something, if Jay, you're walking along and you find something and you think in your mind, the guy who lost this, does he really have a havamina he's going to find this? And you use your judgment and you say, nah, 90 out of 100, a person who lost this. Now, we don't think this way. We don't do this. But if you were to stop and say to yourself, what about this guy? Would he even for a moment say, normal, not stubborn, but normal. Would a person say, I give up on this, there's no way, and that'll be your answer. If you see something unusual about this, then in your mind, you'll say, what would I do? Would I give up if I had something unusual that I had dropped? I would think there's a good Samaritan out there who will find it and maybe announce it. So I'm not going to be miyayish. Now, the more time passes, greater likelihood of years, absolutely. But in the first instance, now, if you're walking along Times Square and then you come home later that day and I had a watch that I was wearing, and I had the watch and I looked at the time and I was riding the metro, and I got to a place and I didn't think about it. An hour or two later, I looked down and says, "Where's my watch?" And then I thought to myself, you know what? The latch may have opened while I was sitting in the metro, and that watch just slipped off my hand. But I have no idea. I didn't take note what train it was, what car it was. I was miyayish. I said, my instant reaction was, oy vey, I lost it. Now, I could have said, you know what? I'm going to call Metro. I'm going to ask them, did someone lose, lost and found. I could have done all of that. But my reaction was, oy vey, I lost the watch. And it was a nice watch. I didn't want to lose it. But what am I going to do? So, in other words, you have to sort of use in your mind. Now, someone else, and I'm pretty sure I lost it in Metro, not while I was walking after the Metro to where I was going. If I factored that in, then how did I even know I lost it in the Metro? Maybe I lost it in the blocks that I was walking to my meeting. So now you begin to see how, woe is to me, I lost it. So that's what he's saying. He's saying that when a person in his own inner self says, oily, forget about it, I lost this. So again, it's subjective to a degree, of course, but that's what a person, again, we're trying to find out what's the mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda, is does a person, you as the finder, will think of the loser and say, okay, what's the likelihood that he's still looking for it? So that's the klal that he gives. Now, the next line is even more instructive, because the next line gives us even more detail. The Omer Rav Zvid Mishmei Rava. Not only did he make that rule, but he said further, Hilchasa, this is the halacha. Okay, we now have what we call black letter law. Krichas b'reshus harabim, which we talked about earlier, right? Little sheaves of grain in the reshus harabim. Hari elu shalo. No need to whatsoever announce, because they are unidentifiable. They're sitting in the middle of reshus harabim. No one in his right mind, if he lost it, would have a havamina that he'll find. Reshus hayochid. However, if he lost it in a more private domain where there aren't a lot of people, now we go into the nuance. I derech nefila, says Rav Zvid, if you find it just lying around as if it fell out of somebody's pocket, harelu shalom. I derech hanocha, notalamachris. If it looks like he put it down on purpose, either to hide it or, I don't know, it was Erev Shabbos, and he realized he was carrying, so he tucked it into a nice corner of the Reshus HaYachid. And someone comes along after Shabbos and sees this little thing sitting there and says, "Oh, someone must have put it there on purpose, because it can't fall out of your pockets and fall into the corner." Then, if it's Derek Hanacha, then we say a person is not miyayish. In other words, if you find something in a private domain, when we say private domain, it could be a carmelis, it could be where some people walk, but not a lot of people walk, and you see it tucked away. And again, we see this with money and other things, where coins are piled in a certain way. We'll see more of this in the Gemara. Then you can't just say it's lost, that the person who lost it will automatically give up. No, he's not going to give up, because it is put in a certain way. Then, noitel machris, he has to announce it. And these are without a siman. In other words, if you find this little sheaf and has no siman on it, but it's put in such a place where it would more likely be placed than falling, even without a simon, you have to announce it. You have to announce it. And how do you announce it? Remember what Rava said. Rava said that you can announce place, you can announce makom. So if you have according to Rava, this is all Rav Zid in the name of Rava. If you have an item where the makom won't help you because it's in a Rishus Harabim, and if people walk over it, they could have kicked it a block away, 2 blocks away. So you can't even announce, I found it at the corner of Lamberton and Arcola, because maybe he dropped it at Kenbrook or Kersey or somewhere else. So in other words, in a Rishus Harabim, makom doesn't help. This is going to Rava. But in a place where makom can help, because it's a Rishus HaYochid, or it's a more private place, even without a simon, you still have to announce. However, Avo b'davar sheyesh bo simon, the last line of the daf. But where there is a simon, then lo shno b'Rishus Harabim, the lo shno b'Rishus HaYochid. Doesn't matter if it's a Rishus Harabim or Rishus HaYochid. Bein derech nefila, bein derech hanocha, chayiv lahachriz. So according to this now view, the halacha that Rav Zvid saying in the name of a Rava, because he's saying hilchasa, this is the halacha, is that when you have something that has a simon, you never are free from the mitzvah of hashavas aveda. Doesn't matter what the circumstance, you have to announce it, because there at least is the possibility that someone is not miyayish. When you don't have a simon, then there are cases where we say yiyush, if it's totally in the public domain, and there are cases where we say no yiyush when it's in the private domain. So this halacha kind of sums up all of the different things that we were talking about. Remember, Rav Zvid saying this in the name of Rava. Rava was an Amora who came many years later, and he saw the machlokes between Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and he saw all of these different permutations that they were talking about, depending on whether or not you hold a simon ne'elav have a simon, or depending on whether you're living in a community that things get picked up or don't pick up. And they say, that machlokes is a wonderful machlokes with Meir of Yehuda, but we're going to be more practical, which is why they announced the machlokes, which isn't the same as the machlokes of the Tanoim. It's not. They basically came along and they summarize it in a way that makes the halacha clearer. So remember, the whole principle of going from Tanoim to Mairoim to Rishonim, Achronim, Ga'onim, until we come all the way to where we are. We have a Shulchan Aruch, we have an Aruch HaShulchan, we have halacha, is that we're constantly refining the halacha and making it more understandable. And to your point, Jay, today, the halacha, because of technology and all the things that we have, will play upon the halacha and will color the halacha, so that machlokes between the Tanoim will be looked at through the eyes of 21st century halacha. And we're going to know more. So we're going to be able to say, you know what, under this circumstance, you're right, but Meir and Yehuda were arguing and discussing the generalities. But now, in every particular case, there's a different halacha, which is why do we have a poskim? Just go to the halacha. The halacha tells us, why do you have a poskim? Because every case is different. Yeah, the poskim looks at the circumstances of the case and says, you know what, it's not exactly that, or it's a little bit more this than that, which is why piskei halacha are not easy. Yeah, every case has its own, particular sort of evolution, and you have to understand it. But here, I think what we get out of the Gemara here at the very end is it's giving us a very clear view. The halacha is like Rava. We are a little bit more, again, because it's a Shabbos Aveda, so we are a little bit more machmer. And we say, in the case of a simon, it doesn't matter where, when, what, you have to announce it. But when you don't have a simon, then depending on where you find it and the circumstance, sometimes no, and sometimes yes. So we kind of come out of this okay, even though we have all these and they are, to understand all the permutations. Yale, what you asked was, it's complicated. It's complicated to understand what it means if will a person be miyayish if he doesn't even know that there's a simon to be had. Okay, so Rabbi Meir says no,
Right.
Rabbi Yehuda says yes. I mean, so that's not always easy to understand. All right, let's take a look at Rashi so we can complete this this sugya. In the Ikeda Amre, where we study Savrua, v'chi itma lema ketanoi emavirin ala ochlin itma. And if you're going to say lema ketanoi, it's the machlekes tanoim. In other words, in this version, he's using the variable of whether or not people will pass on food. Remember what we said is that we had three variables, each of which could be the deciding factor. So the Ikeda Amre said that, you know what the deciding factor is? The deciding factor is whether people will pass on food or not. So that's what Rashi's saying, is that that's, in this Iked Amid, that's the variable. Hilchasa krichas b'shus harabim k'demukalo b'she'ein by simin. So krichas b'shus harabim where there's no simin. So therefore, it depends on whether or not, I mean, we're saying it belongs to him, where there's no simin in the Rishus Harabim, clearly there's never the possibility of identification. Rishus Hayachid, says Rashi, Iderech Nefila Hara'ela Shalom. The Lekka Lamema Mokum have a simin. Oh, wait a minute, according to Rav, it's Mokum. Why didn't you announce the place and said, I found something at the corner of Arcola and Lamberton. Did anybody lose anything? Tell me what you lost. The Holo Yoda Heichen Nafel Minei. Because remember, he doesn't know where it fell. It could have fallen at Kenbrook. It could have fallen somewhere else. So if you're telling me that I lost something at Arcola and Kersey, if you in fact walked, give an example, Yale, you live on Lamberton. So you walk from the shul, you walk down Lamberton to get to your house, right? Wherever your house is. Okay. If I say, I found something on Kenbrook, are you going to weigh in and say, wait a minute, maybe it's mine? No. Why would you think it's yours if it's on Kenbrook? You're on Lamberton. So Mokum there can't be a siman, because if it gets kicked around, you may have lost it on Lamberton, but it was found on Kenbrook. So all of a sudden, you're now going to have to say, oh, he's announcing Kenbrook, I better weigh in here because it's on Kenbrook. So in other words, that Mokum doesn't become a factor anymore because it could be found anywhere. Iderech Hinuach Noitlem Maklis, says Rashi. Now, Rashi's asking, inherently is asking a question. Why not leave it there and announce? There's an item, did someone lose an item? You always weigh whether or not you should pick something up and take it with you, because the guy who lost it may say, oh, I know exactly where I lost it, and he'll come back and it won't be there and he's going to be miyayish. Oh, someone took it already. So in other words, you're balancing whether you should take it or not take it. Says Rashi, Mokta v'lo yanichem sham. You don't leave it there. Shema yimtzem akum v'yitlem v'shema shakum habalim. The balim will forget it, and we're assuming that an akum who doesn't know the halacha, right? It's a good assumption that he'll see it, will pick it up, and walk away. So by leaving it there, if you're in a place where there are not just Jewish people, then you'll say, you know, a Yid has to know the mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda. A Goy doesn't know the mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda. So Rashi's only telling us, as a practical matter, it's better to pick it up and try to announce it to get it back to the person than leave it there on the premise that the person will remember, oh, I lost something, and go right back to the place. Because I do that. I'm sure we all do that. I have, in fact, found things that I dropped on the way from shul to home. I took something out of my pocket, didn't realize I dropped the key. And I said, I had the key. Where is the key? I retraced my steps, and lo and behold, the key is lying there because no one picked it up yet. And it was lying on Arcola Avenue. So in that sense, if someone had picked it up, and let's say it wasn't the key, let's say it was something more different, you know, then I would have been miyayish. I said, oh, forget about it. I lost it. So it's better that someone doesn't pick it up. Teretz is, we're talking about a place where there are Yidden and Goyim, and therefore it's better to pick it up. Sorry?
One quick thing about, and I've thought this before, when we talk about Akum doesn't know the, let's say he might know the halacha. It's like An akum knows about, may well know about kashrus, but he's not bound by kashrus. He may well know about a Shabbos Aveda, but he may figure, you know what? That's not my problem. I don't have the halacha, the rule that I have to do this for this.
Right. Look,
You know.
you can never assume that that a goy will follow halacha. I mean, again, this could be a practical thing where a person says, "Oh, I know someone lost this," and he doesn't know Hashavas Aveda, but he knows if I wear those shoes, I'd like someone maybe to
Right, it could go both ways.
Yeah, exactly. But again, the Gemara is trying to explain why you might not leave it there is because of the possibility if you leave it there, then no one will benefit because it'll just be taken away. So at least take it and announce it. You have a greater chance of Hashavas Aveda than not. Okay, the last Rashi, Avavadav Sheyesh Posimin, Rava L'Tamei. Rava follows his own the Oma Simin, also Lidras Haba Simin. Because Rava is the one who says that Siman also Lidra, something that can be trampled on still is a Siman. Therefore, something that has a Siman, a person will not be Miyayish. So in other words, even in the Rishus HaRabim, where it'll be trampled on, Mela the Rishus HaYafid, okay, fine, there's a greater chance of recovery. But Rishus HaRabim, if there is a Siman, Rava says a person is not Miyayish because of the Siman. So in other words, when you have something that's, and you assume it's somewhat different and unusual to you, human nature is not going to say, I give up just because I may have lost it on a public thoroughfare. I still may find it. Although quite honestly, if someone dropped something in Times Square with a siman, I'm not sure how, maybe someone will say, okay, someone might be a good Samaritan and call me up and tell me that it's mine, so I'm not being the Irish. But then again, that's a subjective question in the mind of the person who loses it, and that's why Rabbah argues. And Rabbah says no, that even with a siman, it's just too much to ask. So, but anyway, the halacha is like Rabbah. So we say that the fear, again, to the question of Jay, should you be the kind of mitzvah Shabbos Aveda? The answer is more often yes than no. The halacha is like Rava, that we should be the kind of mitzvah Shabbos Aveda. So when there's even the outside possibility of something being recovered, short of impossible, dropping a wallet overboard in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, not happening. Okay, with a siman, with all the things in the world, some guy finding it off the coast of Cuba isn't going to return your item even if it has your phone number on it. So there you have to, I mean, the assumption is years, of course, but short of that, siman also lidrus have a siman according to Rabbah. So again, this is all extrapolating, and in any particular case where you're unsure, that's why you ask a shaila. And again, the Paisik is going to have to look at all the variables of the case, and maybe in today's technology, in today's everything else, we're going to say that today that they have sonar and other things that, in other words, you can have embedded chips or things that will allow someone to know where it is. Can you imagine today on Halacha, if you know where it is, right? You put something into your wallet, something that traces it, and you drop your wallet, and behold, you look on your computer and say, "Oh, my wallet is at the corner of Arcola and Kent Mill Road. There it is. I see it." Question: does that change the dynamics? Because today with technology, person isn't mafkir. Person isn't mafkir if he can find it. Again, I'm just giving you an example of where something that was clearly yish years ago may not be yish today, because today you can follow all these things. Again, in cases of kidnapping, where people were kidnapped, Falun, I mean, there was. Today, what happens if we had a chip, something embedded, and all of a sudden you know where he is? Again, it just gives you this pause. It gives pause that the halacha has because of technology and other things, has to be looked at, and you can't. It's not one size fits all and say, yeah, that's the halacha and this is the halacha here. No, that's not the case. In any event, so that's the end of this sugya, and we have the halacha and mitzvah next week. we'll pick up on further to the Mishnah on some of the other cases that the Mishnah presents to us. All right. Again, a lot of food for thought. Very, it's thought provoking. But I think sometimes we have to suspend our what we know, what should be the answer, to understand what the Gemara is trying to really get to at the bottom line.
About 6 months ago, I lost my wallet and I traced everything I did and I couldn't find it. And you right away stop the credit cards and go through all of that stuff.
Right.
And 5 days later, I get a phone call from the people who work the dump and rock up in Gaithersburg that I had lost my wallet at the dump, and I went and got it and everything was in there.
Unbelievable, but that's the example
Goyim return things. They know.
that is something that not only do Goyim return it, but something that Al Pi Seichel should be hefker.
Yeah.
You
And
have it back.
money was still in there. Everything was there.
Everything in there. That maybe makes the point that it's not just so simple to say
Well,
yes or no.
when you drop off spray cans or any liquid, they were asking for your driver's license. So when I took it out and showed them and I put it all back in, it must have slipped out of my pocket. It didn't go in correctly, and
They found it. Unbelievable. Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Okay.